Hey everybody, welcome back to Video Game SO. Today we're going to continue the series on the MiSTer FPGA DE10 Nano project, and today we're going to be doing part 2, taking a look at Taki Udon's clone MiSTer FPGA triple stack. Because in the first video we did the build and I told you it lines up nicely, it turns into a MiSTer and you can start playing some games, but now we're going to be doing some deep dives into the comparisons on the hardware with a lot of cutscenes on a lot of different cores to see exactly how close these two pieces of hardware are together. Before we get to the comparisons though, you're going to be sitting through a 50-second film school class so I can explain the differences in frame rate so you understand how I resolve these tests. But as far as comparing these two pieces of hardware are concerned, we are going to be doing a set criteria. It's going to be a single RAM build on the newest RAM modules, and it is going to be using the exact same SD card installation, the exact same OS, the exact same core dates. I'm just transporting the card between MiSTer FPGA and Taki Udon's MiSTer FPGA so we know we're using the exact same file set on the exact same builds, and all of the builds are the most recent ones as well. Now to that film school segment, I want to talk about 59.97 frames per second versus an even 60. Any test that has a 1 frame variable in a lock cutscene where I do not have control is considered to be par. That is because your television at home, what you're watching this on, is more likely than not exhibiting at a 59.97 per second frame rate. And because of that not being an even, at certain points in time, things can get out of alignment, frames can be dropped. This is the standard as a filmmaking process. And just so you guys know, I do have a master's degree in cinematography and direction. I've also taught film classes at the college level to other filmmakers. This is what I really do for a living. I've been doing it over 2 decades, so just take my word for this that a 1 frame discrepancy can occur and is expected to happen. That is not strange whatsoever. There is drift in filmmaking. It's just never over a long enough period of time for you to ever actually notice it. Now that we've gotten that out of the way, we're going to go right into JetForce Gemini. The first core I wanted to test on the clone versus MiSTer FPGA, just to see what's going on here, because this definitely pushes the hardware to the absolute limit of what is possible. And just so you can tell, the Mr. Coon with the sunglasses on is going to be Taki Udon. I just had to make a variable there. And all of these tests are done by taking the first hard cut in any lock sequence, where the camera hard cuts from one scene to another, and locking it to that. Now later on in the video, when I do find differences, I'll even go into the resolve timeline to show you how those differences are found and how many frame variable there could be as a difference. Now as far as Nintendo 64 is concerned, it's a very interesting result, but it is within the margin of error. In some instances, the clone gets 1 to 2 frames ahead of an actual MiSTer FPGA. That 1 frame we throw away as a data set, the 2 frames does mean something to us. But the reality is, I ran all of these tests 3 times, and MiSTer FPGA with a Terasic DE10 board can also get 1 to 2 frames ahead of the clone board. You can have a frame pacing difference across both pieces of hardware, and I think that's just down to the difference in the latency on the RAM for MiSTer. The RAM on board the Terasic DE10, not the 128 megabytes of RAM that you have on the stick. Because this is being shared with other low-level operations on MiSTer FPGA, including the scaler, and it is waiting for calls to both read and write cycles, you can end up in situations where it does change. So as far as using this long-term locked-off cut sequence from JetForce Gemini, I'm really not surprised to see a 2 frame variable across both the clone board as well as the Terasic manufactured DE10. That is just how Nintendo 64 goes on MiSTer FPGA, especially with the games that hit that RAM harder, faster, stronger, and that's why I chose JetForce Gemini, because it is one of those late-stage games on Nintendo 64, and it definitely feels more like a GameCube game that should have been held over for GameCube versus a hardware pushing Nintendo 64 game that definitely struggles. So as far as the comparison here on the JetForce Gemini cut sequence with MiSTer FPGA and the Taki MiSTer Pi, they are within the margin of error, and I have absolutely nothing to say about them except they're doing the same thing. They have the same visuals, they look the same, they sound the same, as you would hope for and expect. And that's really what I'm looking for doing these direct comparisons, is to try to find any situation in which the 2 pieces of hardware have a fork or delineation between one and the other. That way you can understand which one's doing what and whether or not that would be any sort of issue in the future. But again, as far as GeForce Gemini is concerned, they do seem fine. And just so you know, for a factoid basis, I'm running these through the same capture card with the exact same settings. They're sitting in the same resolve timeline, and you really can't have two different settings in resolve for that same timeline. Now moving over to something like Bomberman Hero, this is first on the Terasic manufactured DE10 Nano, and you will see the logos in the corner of the screen explaining which one is which. Again, Mr. Coon without sunglasses is Terasic, Mr. Coon with sunglasses is the Taki clone. This is just Bomberman Hero. Obviously, I've been talking about it on the channel since the beginning of the Nintendo 64 core because it is my absolute favorite Nintendo 64 game of all time. Here on MiSTer FPGA on a Terasic board, it is absolute perfection, and it is my absolute favorite way to play the game. And this is a game that I have played to death. Pretty much every game you're going to see in this test outside of GeForce Gemini there is a game that I'm intimately familiar with, so I know and can feel if there is any difference between the two hardware platforms. So if you don't see your favorite game here, that's because you're watching some of my favorite games. Move over to the Taki clone. The gameplay is 100% identical. There are no issues. There's no visual corruption. There is nothing here that if I didn't indicate with the logo at the bottom of the screen that this is the clone board. So as far as gameplay is concerned on Nintendo 64, and as far as the cutscene variables are concerned that I have found, they are well within the margin of error. This is currently at a par situation. Now let's move over to the Bomberman Hero intro cut sequence, and again you're going to see that everything is locked. I use again the hard cut in the first part of the scene where the camera hard changes without any sort of fades or transitions, so I know I am on the same frame. And throughout this entire cut sequence, we're going to see a 1 frame difference, and again with the difference in frame rate being 59.97 and having to deal with that rounding, that is always going to be something that can and will occur. And trust me, 1/60th of a second, you would never be able to know it was even there if I didn't tell you about it. And the other reality is the Terasic manufactured DE10 board can get 1 frame ahead of the clone. So they both will drift by 1 frame. Both pieces of hardware can be ahead of the other one. And that is just how these things work. So as far as the takeaway from these cut sequences right here, they are again within the margin of error with that rounding situation. They are 1-to-1 par doing the exact same thing. Let's take a look at the Wave Race intro, one more for Nintendo 64. They're going to change the platform because this is a comprehensive-ish test across some of my favorites. You'll see here we're going to do the same thing with Wave Race, and you're going to have the exact same hard cuts, and everything's going to be transitioning fine. The only difference here in Wave Race is, interestingly enough, at the last possible moment before the big Wave Race logo comes up, the jet skier on the clone board seems to get more air into the air than on MiSTer FPGA with a Terasic board. But there's always been something about the introductory sequence to Wave Race that I feel like might actually do different things even on real hardware. And if you guys are interested, I can bring real hardware into the mix just to see which one's closer, but at that point in time, I'm really not testing differences in clone boards versus Terasic made boards. I am testing them against real hardware, and that is a different type of video. But you'll see here, these are doing the exact same thing. They have the exact same visuals. Just watch this last jump right here. The jet skier just gets a little bit more air on the right. I have no explanation for that. If you know something about the introductory sequence to Wave Race, tell me in the comments below. Now moving over to the Neo Geo AES, my favorite 2D console of all time. You know damn well if you watch the channel, I'm going to make you watch Matra Melee. This is my favorite fighting game of all time. Not saying it is the best, I'm just saying it's my favorite. And right now we're watching the Mr. Pi clone board in action, and it looks, feels, sounds, and plays exactly like I'd expect Neo Geo AES and MVS to play. So as far as the gameplay experience here in the games I'm testing, including Nintendo 64, with only that 1 frame rounding variable that is par, I'm getting the exact same fun, the exact same experience out of the Taki Udon clone board that I am out of the Terasic manufactured board. And that's all I really care about in this instance. As we move over to the Terasic DE10, the colors, the gameplay, the action, all of the animations are 1-to-1. There is no detectable difference in them whatsoever. I definitely went over this footage for a long period of time, and just so you guys know, even though this is only about a 25-minute video, this was over 12 hours of functional work for me to capture and then go through it in Resolve to pick everything out. And as far as the intro cut sequence for Master Melee is concerned, again, it is within that 1 frame margin, and therefore it is 1-to-1, and that's always a good thing to see. And again, remember, when I talk about frames later on and we get further apart from 1 frame per second, you have to really ask yourself, does that actually technically matter to you? Do you care about it? Is it just a mathematical difference, or is it something that actually feels more like a foundational difference? Now let's move over to Giru Mark of the Wolves, obviously one of the best fighting games ever made, and in my opinion the best fighting game on Neo Geo, and it definitely rivals and even exceeds most of Capcom's 2D fighters, but I'm sure that's going to get some comments down below. Right now we're playing on the Taki clone, the Mr. Pi, and I'm going to keep trading back and forth on those names because Mr. Pi is still such a new name. I'm trying to get it internalized into my head. The gameplay here is absolute perfection. This is Mark of the Wolves. It's exactly how I'd expect it to be. It's exactly how I remember playing it. I can get the same inputs in. And just so you know, as an additional locked variable, every single game I'm playing is using the exact same controller with the exact same USB cable going into the USB hub. So there is no difference on controllers here whatsoever. Everything was done with exactly the same hardware. Now moving over to the Terasic board, you're going to see again, they basically look identical. And don't worry about the difference in B. Janet's clothing color here. That is a variable in Mark of the Wolves. It's a variable in pretty much every fighting game on Neo Geo. Sometimes you just hit the button and you get a different color clothing, and that is just down to which input button you use. And I actually did that intentionally just so I could better track the footage as well for me, because that is how incredibly close these things are. If it wasn't for the file naming convention, if it wasn't for those small touches like having a different color clothing on her, I would be very, very hard pressed to ever be able to detect which one was which, and honestly I don't really think I could whatsoever. So Neo Geo, as far as everything is concerned, 100% identical. But let's move over to Sega Saturn. Definitely a core that is pushing the MiSTer FPGA. Right now we're taking a look at the Taki Udon clone footage, and then we'll move over to MiSTer FPGA with the Terasic board, and then I will let you watch the cutscene with the audio involved, because one, this is a long voiceover and I need a little bit of a break, and two, I want you to hear the audio quality, and then I will tell you what you were listening to after the fact. But as far as the gameplay here at the start, Sega Saturn with the Mr. Pi, Sega Saturn with the Terasic, good to go. But here's that audio.
Roger, we got a bad situation down there. We got a band of terrorists that have seized control of the building. They're holding 30 hostages inside, including the president's daughter. I repeat, they have the president's daughter in there. We have to get her out as soon as possible. Over.
Now the question is, which audio we were listening to? Was it the DE10 Nano from Terasic, or was it the Mr. Pi? And the answer to that is it was actually both. At the exact halfway point in that clip, I switched from one waveform to the other, and because the intro cut sequence was in lockstep from one source to the other, that means the audio was too, so I was able to switch in midstream, and you had no idea. That means it is 1-to-1 perfect, and trust me, your ear is a lot better at hearing problems than your eye is about seeing them on screen. The human ear, the sense of sound, is one of those things. You can have a movie with bad visuals and great sound, people will love it. Have a movie with great visuals and bad sound, everyone will hate it. We hate bad audio problems way more than we hate visual problems. It is just how the human mind works when it comes to the eye and the ear. I know I'm getting a little bit deep and scientific in this, but it is something that we deal with a lot in film production. I teach film students as well about the importance of audio quality. And basically right here, again on Die Hard Arcade for Sega Saturn, it is 1-to-1 par, no difference whatsoever. I can test more Saturn games in the future if you guys really want to see a part 2 of this, but I'm kind of hoping this video will probably be the only comparison I do by the end, because honestly I don't really want to keep doing these things over and over again. It is a ton of work, but if you guys really want to see it, do put some requests for games down below, just for Nintendo 64, PlayStation 1, and Sega Saturn. For the rest of them, maybe not into going back and checking those out. But again, whether you're playing on a DE10 Nano made by Terasic or a DE10 Nano made by Taki Udon's company, you're getting the same thing. But now let's move into PlayStation 1, because this one's going to get a little bit more interesting. We're starting here on the Terasic manufactured board playing Crash Bandicoot 3, a game I absolutely love and know like the back of my hand. And the interesting thing is, in this footage here, I'm even going to die at the exact same spot. I make the same mistake in the same manner across both boards, and it gives me consistent enough gameplay for me to be stupid in the exact same manner. And as far as the gameplay on PlayStation 1 is concerned, switching over to the Taki board, they are again identical. You would not be able to know any differences between them because I couldn't really find any detectable differences between them. The interesting information is actually going to come in the locked cut sequences, and I'm going to get very granular with this, bringing you into my resolve timeline and going into a frame viewer to explain exactly what it is you're seeing so there is no confusion. So before you make any comments as to any differences here, please watch that section of the video and understand how the information is derived so I know you've actually paid attention to that part. It is going to be quite important in the future. But as far as the gameplay is concerned, again, there really isn't any difference here. You're going to see I'm going to die on the Taki clone, and I'm going to die at the exact same spot on MiSTer FPGA with a Terasic board. So I can play this game exactly the same across both sources, and that is always fun to be able to see your gaming habits and your muscle memory basically betray you the exact same way across two different runs. But let's get into the locked off cut sequence. Again, these are going to be frame locked to this transition right there, and once we get into the resolve timeline after I show you this, I will verify that that's exactly where that first screen transition takes place on. And remember, again, this is the exact same file on the exact same micro SD card being transported from one unit to the other while I do the testing. And this is where maybe you might start noticing a little bit of a difference in both sources. When it is one frame, sometimes you might notice it, sometimes your subconscious might notice it, but it is very hard to actively pick that out. But once you get beyond a one frame difference between the sources, your eye is going to notice it, it is going to be detectable, and in this short of a clip, 2 or more frames would definitely be outside of the margin of error on that 59.97 capture. So that's what we're going to go in here and take a look at. And it might even be hard to notice here where the differences are going to start appearing, but they're going to be fundamentally in this cut sequence where the furthest delta between one frame transition and the other is going to be. But pay attention, kind of watch here. I'm actually going to let you listen to the audio because I want you to focus on the cutscene. Once the cutscene is over, we'll be back in Resolve and I'll explain what I'm doing. But go ahead and listen and watch closely.
And I have lost my patience! There is now no other power source left on this planet.
I know we've had a few unfortunate setbacks.
And failed! But since your bumbling has managed to set me free, I am feeling generous. There is still a way for us to amass the power needed to enslave this miserable planet. And this time the great Uka will make sure that you do it right!
So now let's jump into the resolve timeline and talk about what it is I'm seeing, because I did repeat this test 3 times and the result was consistent across all 3 tests. So what I'm showing you here is using the left arrow and the right arrow to go frame by frame, and you're going to see that all of the objects appear at the same time, and I'm even going to go right into the highest magnification on the timeline so you can watch the timeline scrub back and forth between those 2 frames. And this is all one clip, so we know we have frame lock between hard cut transitions here. You're going to see this object come in, and as we advance a little bit, it's going to change the scene at the exact same time. So now we're going to go further down the line because again, this is just one cutscene. Now it does fade in and out between the 2 of them, so is it possible that there is a slight speed difference in the loading across the different boards on the same SD card? That is possible. You'll now see here that the screen transition is going to be off and we're beyond the 1 frame per second. That could be part of that 59.97 frames per second. So on the Taki Udon MiSTer Pi clone side, PlayStation 1 seems to be running ahead of a Terasic manufactured board, but we're still only 2 frames here. Honestly, that really isn't the biggest difference, and it's kind of the type of thing you need to decide whether or not you even care if it runs 2 frames ahead. But let's move to the most fundamental difference I was able to find comparing the PlayStation core between MiSTer FPGA as a Terasic board and MiSTer FPGA as a clone board. And I basically did all of these tests 3 times just to see if anything was a variable. So we're going to find the hard cut in this cut sequence right here, and you're going to see that the right hand side of the screen, the clone board, is already ahead. And if I keep hitting the right arrow, we end up at 7 frames run ahead on that between MiSTer FPGA with a Terasic and the clone board. And because this is all still the same clip, we're starting to get a higher variable. Now again, they fade out and fade back in, so is it possible that one is loading quicker on the clone board versus the Terasic DE10 Nano? That is a possibility. Is it a deterministic versus indeterministic situation? Could be as well, and you'll see here, I'm just moving the clips around for you so you know they are one clip. Let's move over to Symphony of the Night, and I'm going to use the exact same technique here to see whether or not things run ahead. And I'm going to give you another sound sample so you can hear the audio quality, because again, I'm going to mix and match between the clone and the Terasic board in real time, and I bet not a single one of you can tell the difference, and I know you can't because there really isn't one. But enjoy.
You steal men's souls and make them your slaves.
Perhaps the same could be said of all religions.
Your words are as empty as your soul. Mankind ill needs a savior such as you.
What is a man? A miserable little pile of secrets. But enough talk. Have at you!
Now there were 4 different changes in between words in Dracula and Richter's speech there, and I did it mid-sentence and mid-word, so you really can't tell any difference because I know you didn't. Now looking at the next difference, I'm using the D in Die Monster here, the first frame that it appears on both the Terasic DE10 and the MiSTer Pi, and that is my first frame of reference. What I'm going to do is advance all the way until the point of this conversation being over so I can more accurately show you what the difference is here. Right now on the eye, we are just 1 frame different, so that's not too big of a deal, but I want to actually take a look at this transparent box in which the text goes over and see when that actually leaves the screen, because I was able to instantaneously notice this when I was looking at the footage. I'm even going to get a little closer here in the timeline and on the actual zoom so you can better see it. And I hope these do help you better understand what it is I'm talking about going into the actual software that I do use here. So what I'm doing is I'm going to start advancing around frame by frame once I get to the point in the timeline that I want to be, and I'm going to blow all the way in, so every single time you see that red line move, that is a frame within the actual video in and of itself, 159.97 or 1/60th of a second, because honestly once you push the button it's not rounding anything whatsoever. You'll see the text disappear here and Dracula's portrait is going to start to shrink out. But what I really want to know is what the last frame that blue transparent box is on screen and when it leaves. You'll see here on one end it is gone right at that transition, and it takes another 3 frames for that box to disappear off the Terasic side of things. So as far as this sequence is concerned, when it is locked together, it is running 3 frames ahead by the time it is done. So PlayStation 1 seems to have a different frame pacing on the clone boards. Now I don't exactly know why that is occurring. It's going to take a lot more research and information by a lot of people to answer that question. I am just here to provide observable differences, and you can make the determination whether or not you care about those and have some questions and obviously some maybe pending answers as to why you think it happens. But I'm not here to tell you the reason why, I'm here to tell you the observable difference. And as far as Sega Genesis is concerned, I had to test Streets of Rage 2 because it also has a really nice locked long cut sequence in the beginning, and this right here, dead on the money, 1-to-1 perfect. So really across all of my tests here, PlayStation 1 seemed to be the outlier, the one that seemed to run ahead in consistent 3 times repeated tests. But as far as the actual intro cut sequence here on Streets of Rage 2, it is doing the exact same thing in the exact same manner at the exact same frame pacing over and over and over again. And if you're wondering why sometimes you're going to get 1 frame off and sometimes you're not, I could break down all of the wild math and variables in that 59.97 frame per second sort of tactic there, but honestly just take this away if nothing else. It's kind of just random and it kind of just happens. That's what happens when you get to these numbers and situations. So when you see something that is just 1 frame apart, just consider those par. And watching this play right here, it looks amazing, it sounds amazing, and if I didn't tell you that the logos on the screen were one board or another, there is absolutely nobody watching this, and I am confident in this sentence that would be able to tell the difference apart between a Terasic DE10 Nano and a MiSTer Pi. That is how good these two things really are side by side in 99 out of 100 instances. And now I'm just playing some S-Prod-D on the Taki Udon clone, because you know what really is a test for me? I'm not going through trying to check frames. That's a mathematical observation. It is a deviation I can measure. It is the feel of a game. I can pretty much consistently, every single time I play this game, beat the first boss without taking a single hit, and that is what I'm going to do here. If the Taki Udon MiSTer Pi was any sort of laggy, any sort of performance that was lacking from the Terasic DE10 Nano, I would immediately be able to tell in this game. You can have absolutely nothing but perfection when it comes to cave bullet hell shmups, or else you are just going to end up dying, and I'm showing you this from start to finish so you better understand I did exactly what I said I did, which was not take a single hit on this first level boss. So you can kind of decide how you feel about that frame pacing difference in PlayStation 1. Honestly, they are cut sequences, they aren't real gameplay, therefore you would probably never notice if I didn't point it out to you. My personal takeaway is it'll be fun to find out the answer as to why PlayStation 1 might be running ahead in those cut sequences, but I honestly really don't care all that much because I'm not playing the game, I'm just watching something, and if I didn't look under the hood and find them, I don't think I would have ever known they were there. Sometimes you can measure something and the result is a quantifiable number, but in reality if you didn't know that number existed, you would never know the difference was there in the first place. And as far as stuff like the MIDI Pi hats, the snack adapters, things such as mixing and matching IO boards, that's going to be coming in a part 3 because they're already at 25 minutes, getting into 26 just based on comparisons, because this video ended up being a lot longer than I thought it would be, and it was very interesting for me to make. But if you have any questions or comments, or you need a better explanation as to that one frame variable, you can nicely ask down below, and I'm happy to talk to you guys all day about it. But as far as the slight variances, honestly, in the grand scheme of things, fun games are fun games, good hardware is good hardware, and I would 10 out of 10 times and twice on Sunday pick up the MiSTer Pi if you do not have a MiSTer FPGA and you want to get into the ecosystem. The hardware is spectacular, the results are great, and 5 to 6 frames in a cut sequence might be down to just some weird behavior of PlayStation 1 that we just don't know about. But short of that, we are done. There's your comparison. If you want to see more, let me know down below, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.